Yeah. Right on. What was the discussion about?
Even just back.
It's just like. What would happen if duplexes and residential. Start cutting. Duplexes goals, probably not. So we should allow them. That was like the nature of this. That's what I'm opposed. Correct. I mean, originally.
I did allow survey on one of the.
Yes, yeah.
By the way, it's a zoning administrator's interpretation of if two buildings are abutting, you don't consider them to be a
We have.
only if there's common parking lot.
Hey folks, let's go ahead and take this, we're gonna get started. You're all over here. And then Brian, he's gonna come over here because Preston, if he makes it at all, he's gonna be late.
Okay.
Don't wanna leave you by yourself.
Preston can do that.
Benny, did you wanna move over? Oh,
Elizabeth, based on travel, I am not going to be back in time to be in person, so I'll be remote the whole time.
I was worried about that, given the time of day you were leaving. Okay, all right. We're gonna go ahead and call the meeting to order. This is as many of our council members are at the Governor's Housing Conference today. And unfortunately, Burt Pennock had to resign from the council, but Brian White, another member of the City Planning Commission to my right, has been appointed to take his place. So welcome, Brian. We're excited to have you. I'm gonna go ahead and call roll. Janice Brown. Wayne Creedle.
Here.
Benny Gates.
Here.
Philip Hart.
Here.
Yana James. Kendra Norrell.
Shanice is walking in right now.
Thank you. Casey Overton.
This thing. I'm sorry.
Michelle Parrish. Maritza Peachin. Here. Damian Pitt. Brian White.
Here.
Charlie Wilson.
Here.
Roger York. Thank you. All right, so we received a request from Preston Lloyd to participate in the meeting virtual from the road as he's driving back from the Governor's Housing Conference. So I will need a motion to approve Mr. Lloyd's request to participate in the meeting virtually.
So moved. Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, Preston, you're welcome to join us remotely. Just let us know if you have any problems hearing us.
Will do. Thank you.
So thank you for joining us today. Just as a reminder, the Advisory Council is a subcommittee of the city's Planning Commission. And the council is charged with advising the Planning Commission, the Department of Planning and Development Review, and the consultant team in the zoning ordinance revision process. The public will have an opportunity to speak during the public comment period at the beginning of the meeting. The first order of business is to approve the October meeting notes. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to look through the notes that Mary Ann sent. Did anyone have any comments or edit? Get a motion?
Moved.
Second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor? Any opposed? So at this time, we'll open the public comment. This is the opportunity for the general public to comment on items not on the agenda. So we'll start with those that are in the room first. Is there anyone in the room that would like to offer public comment at this time? Sir, could you come forward and please provide us your name?
Where would you like me to stand?
Absent of a podium, that's perfect.
Hi, my name is Richard Hankins. I'm the Executive Director of the Partnership for Smarter Growth. We advocate for a Richmond region that plans sustainably, grows inclusively, and connects communities in accordance with the 10 principles of smart growth. We're concerned by the acute housing shortage in Richmond, leading to higher and higher prices for both renters and buyers, and thus causing displacement. As such, we advocate for zoning that allows Richmond to build more housing while also maintaining the historic nature of so many of our beloved neighborhoods. PSG supports duplexes by right across the city, and as talked about, the 12 plexes along major streets zoned for residential use, both topics brought up last month. As well, we would like to see more of the economic viability reporting, similar to the ones in October, to gain a better understanding of the potential impacts or lack thereof of the zoning changes. When reviewing the projected economic viability, we were struck by the incredibly low annual rates of change. While Richmond must strike a balance, some of these low rates year to year will not lead to the development of more housing we desperately need. Additional housing that would have the potential to lower housing costs, increase sustainability, and add much needed financial tax base, fostering economic opportunity that Richmond is. A part of this should come from aligning our city zoning to allow for our beloved historic districts and housing stock such as Jackson Ward and the Fan. The zoning should allow for that. In many ways, it does not. We are excited to see the being built right now. We appreciate the work that the Zoning Advisory Council, planning staff, and consultants are doing to ensure we can have a zoning code that fosters a vibrant and prosperous city. We hope to continue to see this kind of context-informed decision-making.
Thank you. Anybody else that would like to offer comment here in the room?
Yeah.
Okay, do we have anybody online that would like to offer comment? I don't see any hands raised. Okay, Mary Ann, am I missing anyone?
No, I don't see.
Okay, so there's no one online. At this time, we'll go ahead and close the public comment period and move into our agenda. So our next item is Mary Ann is going to give us a kind of a recap. We jump into this month's contact. She'll provide a brief recap of the council's previous meetings and introductions to the goals for today's meeting, just to kind of help us give not just a refresh, but stay on task for why we're here today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mary Ann.
You'll see. See on the screen, the timeline, which we began in February with the project initiation. The things that the advisory council have been working on primarily through this process is reviewing the pattern book and the zoning code districts and framework. And then we'll be going to the community with more details beginning of next year. The pattern book, we began by looking at a citywide scale of the development of the city, looking at conformities and nonconformities, lot size, building width, just the development of the city going forward. We scaled down looking at neighborhood scale of select number of neighborhoods throughout the city that represented other neighborhoods or had specific characteristics, focusing on these historic neighborhoods. And then down to the block scale, which is something that you'll get to see this evening. Portions of the block scale is the focus of tonight's portion of the agenda that's focused on the pattern book. Tonight, you'll see it's going to be mainly a presentation with the opportunity to ask some clarifying questions. And next month, we'll have the opportunity for a little bit more discussion on the pattern book. So that's one aspect the advisory council has been working on. Second, the draft framework, which Colin and Renee have been bringing at every meeting. We began with a discussion of comparing Richmond 300 to the existing zoning districts. The last few meetings have been mainly focused on the residential future land use category and the neighborhood mixed use future land use category. Everything, all the zoning is built off of Richmond 300. We began with these two land use categories. The thought is when we go to the community, these might be the most controversial where people live. So that's why the focus of the conversations have been residential and the neighborhood mixed use category. Tonight, you'll be able to see all of proposed zoning districts draft, obviously, for all the different land use categories. You'll see your input from residential and neighborhood mixed use, hopefully within those two categories. Again, tonight's meeting is going to be primarily presentations, opportunities to ask them clarifying questions, questions around the districts, mainly first impressions, naming protocol. Even as we go out to the community, those things are important. And then also the number of districts, if those make sense. Next meeting, we're gonna really dive deep into these districts and have the opportunity for small group conversations so that everyone will have a chance to share their comments. But tonight it's gonna be a lot. It's gonna be presentation heavy, so we just want to make you aware.
Thank you, Marianne. Does anyone have any questions for Marianne?
I do. You said next meeting will be a deep dive into the different categories. Is that all of them or just, will that include residential and mixed use? That's to come up next meeting.
So Renee is gonna do a presentation. He's going to share all of the information that you'll see in these and the presentations. But next meeting we'll have a deep dive, more conversation.
You're gonna see all the districts, all proposed settling districts for the entire city that cover residential areas and mixed use areas and industrial areas.
We all have a month to digest all of this information, study it, and come back with all of our questions.
Any question in between that time, staff is always available to sit down and talk through anything that you want to go through.
Before we jump into the next item on our agenda. All right, it's a quiet group today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Renee Bieberstein, who's going to give us a follow-up on the October presentation.
Actually, better to start with Carlos to get into the pattern book, and then we can switch over to myself.
That's fine.
Carlos?
All right. Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great.
Well.
Thank you. 1 second. Let me share my screen. Wait, where did this one go? I'm not sure if the share screen is enabled or not.
View a presenter.
Oh, there we go. Never mind. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. So as Marianne mentioned just a few minutes ago, the pattern book is being this progression of analysis across scales, where we started city scale to have an overall pattern of nonconformities, then go into a neighborhood scale where we choose in collaboration with the city staff 10 different neighborhoods where we were diving more in depth, a mix of traditional historical neighborhoods and more outer, less dense kind of neighborhoods. And now we jump at a block scale. What the block scale is allowing us to do now, and you'll see in a minute, is to dive into more form patterns that we can measure, but like rather than relay on data. City scale and neighborhood scale has relied a lot in geographic information systems and analytical data. The block scale has allowed us to actually do visual survey either in person or using digital tools, and to illustrate contextual patterns. So the different analysis that we did just a quick mapping of the block of the year built for those buildings in the block, and then there's we did a character and frontage study where and I'll explain more in depth once we keep going. We divided and create a few, or classify a few building types depending on what we were constantly seeing on the different areas that we analyzed. This becomes really important when we get to a property type. I'll more that in a minute. We look into frontage, how the building presents itself to the street, roof lines and fenestration, how like the roof shapes and the amount of windows that those buildings have. We look at lot dimensions, just like on the other scales, but in this case, we were able to to adjust some of our analysis based on some form conditions that we were able to capture on the ground. And finally, and more importantly, the block scale is allowing us to analyze setbacks. How much are the buildings a setback from the street, from the sides, and in the rear? The zoning has several yard minimum requirements with various conditions and allow and requirements depending on the lot dimension and the lot and the zoning district. The building types. This was mostly trying to focus on the size of a building, the attachment or detachment of the buildings between each other, the scale and use, and the intensity of use, mostly within the districts that we were analyzing, which is R4, R5, R6, and R63, R7 and R63. Overall, there's a detached residential form that we divided in a detached house and a detached urban, which is a detached house that is closer to the street, closer between buildings. It has a more urban nature in its way. The attached residential forms, which are buildings that are either touching each other and have a shared sidewall in one end or on both ends. So that's the difference between the semi-detached and the attached houses. The semi-attached is just two buildings are touching on one end, and attached is on both sides, but they're both considered attached buildings. And then the other building types, walk-ups and walk-up apartments, which are small scale and larger scale apartment buildings. Walk-ups, mostly up to 9 units. Walk-up apartments is just a larger scale of those buildings. Those are buildings that normally are under no more than 3 stories because there's no elevator. It's more a historical, it's a common typology that even from a historical standpoint. Duplexes is just whenever we saw a building with 2 units that were designed to be a 2-unit, that is different than the houses that were more non-different between a single family or a single family was transformed into a 2-family unit. General commercial, just buildings with ground floors, commercial and some mixed use on top. Civic buildings and shop fronts are just 1-story buildings that are for commercial purposes. We at the end we look into 14 blocks, at least 1 per neighborhood, and several neighborhoods got a couple more spread around the city. And as mentioned, they're mostly grouped in R6, R63, R5, R7, and 1 R4 in West Hampton. Now the methodology, and this is important, I'll flesh out in more detail. So the 3 main analysis that we were able to do at block scale is 1, character of frontage. That was done by a walking tour that I was able to do last time I was in Richmond for the August SAC meeting. Then all those findings were also expanded using Street View and Google Earth imagery. These frontage analysis produced several outcomes. The building type that I just refer, the frontage types, if they're porches, if they're stoops, if they're balconies, if the porches are risen or there's like stairs, if there's a semi-basement, if there are fences, the roof lines, and the amount of windows. And these, all of, especially the building types, produces what we define for this analysis, the property type. What is this? It's a mix between if it's a single, 2, or multifamily, and plus if it's attached or attached. And this is very important because the current zoning creates different metrics for the R6, R7, R8, R63, and other denser residential districts. There are different metrics and different requirements depending if you fit in each category. If you're single family attached or detached, 2-family attached or detached, different numbers, different setbacks, different lot sizes, different lot widths. So by defining that property type, we were able to revisit and refine our nonconformity analysis for each property type. So we were able to attach to each parcel if there were single, 2-family, if they're attached or detached. which will give us more in detail lot size minimums, lot width minimums, and lot coverage. Lot coverage and building height that's the same across the different property types. And then the same thing for setbacks. We were able to measure using, and all this measurement was done using aerial imagery and Google Earth and LiDAR information, an estimate of the distance between the edge of the principal structures, that is without accounting for porches or balconies or stoops, the actual principal structure to the given property lines in the 4 directions. So we were able to get an estimate of a front setback, both of the side setbacks and the rear setback. How does this look per each block? And it looks like a lot of information, and it is, but hopefully I'll be able to explain this in a way that that all these spreadsheets become digestible. So we have 4 columns. In addition, we did circulation. I'm not going to dive into this one. This was just because we were collecting already data about alleys and topography, but overall, it's more important to focus on character and dimensions. So the first character and frontage, we look at the building type, the frontage type, as you see, like if it has a stairs and porch, if it has only a porch, if it has a stoop. Then the next 2 columns, if there's a fence or if there's a semi-basement. Semi-basement is when the building is risen from the ground enough that is actually a livable space on that basement, which is more common on historical neighborhoods. If the fenestration, if the amount of windows is over 50%, there's more windows than walls. There's an equal amount of windows and walls, or there's more walls than windows. It's a very approximate judgment, qualitative analysis, but just to give us an idea of how the buildings look. The roofline type, if it's flat, if it's a shed, if it's a gable, if it's a hip, it's a mansard. And then the property type that I mentioned, if it's single family attached, 2 family attached, 2 family attached, 2 family or single family attached in others, or if it's multifamily, as there's one in this slide that is color orange. That definition defined what was the metric that we had to judge each parcel to. So in terms of lot size, lot width. So depending on the property type, sometimes they were going to be built 2 lots of the same size and same frontage, but because one is a single family attached and one is a 2 family attached, they will have different metrics. Building height, and then on the setbacks, the front setback, the 2 side setbacks, and the rear setback, and if the property has or doesn't have an accessory structure in the back. So I know this was a lot of download of information, but overall, this is what we did for every single parcel on every one of the blocks. So every block has a table like this where you have each of the addresses with each of the conditions. So this is an example for Jackson Ward. Block number 1 was this block on the left between Clay and Marshall Street. So as mentioned, we did a historical context. We refined lot analysis and lot width of nonconformities. In some cases, some buildings that used to be nonconforming, they tip now into conformity because we were able to give them, this is actually, because the neighborhood analysis was done assuming everything was single family detached, because most of the buildings are. But whenever we were able to say, this is actually a single family attached, then those buildings have less restrictions, or the numbers are lower. So those buildings or those parcels tip to conformity. Same for lot width. For setbacks, this is an overall diagram to show in dashed green lines what are the required setbacks for each of the parcels in this district, and in this case Jackson Ward, and then how the existing building footprint fits or doesn't fit within those setbacks. Important to note here that the diagram represents the range of setbacks and is not accounting for the zero setback that can happen on attached properties. We couldn't do that so in detail and level of drawing, so because we were doing this in parallel, so we couldn't know which buildings were actually attached or not attached while we were doing this graphic. So this is showing the range of setback per parcel, but in some cases, buildings that are attached to each other don't require a side setback, and I'll get that in when we see some of the results. And also, we map the character of each of the blocks, where the building types that I just described, and some assessment of, okay, how they look when they have, like, let's say the first photo on the top is if someone has a semi-basement, the building is half a story higher from the street. That semi-basement is actually a livable space, so that has that condition. Or like the one on the bottom is also rise from the street, but it's not really that livable space. It's more of a basement, so that one's just classified as a porch, and so on and so on. This is how it looks for that entire block, right? Where we're able to start seeing, okay, where are more red, where is more green, and start trying to identify those patterns. Main takeaways. Overall, lot sizes and lot widths we were able to find substandard lot sizes and lot widths still across the districts. And many non-conforming parcels, there's like a relative correlation between having a substandard lot size and a substandard lot width. So when we put all the blocks together, so this means every column that you see here is each of the blocks we analyze, and they're classified per zoning district that they belong. We see that there is a degree of nonconformity in all of them. The more urban or denser residential district, the most likely they were going to be nonconformities, but still we found certain neighborhoods in the R5 district, for example, that, let's say this second block in the Oak Grove neighborhood, that half of that block, all the parcels are substandard for lot width and for lot size. And this is when I meant about the correlation, that this is a very good example where both lots have normally the same depth, but because one side of a block has narrower blocks, the size of a block of a parcel becomes substandard because it doesn't meet the 5,000 minimum required. The same thing happens in the R6 district. We have these section of a block number 1 in the fan, where we have narrower blocks that also mean narrower parcels and require, even after adjusting for their property type. As I said, some parcels did become conforming that used to be identified as non-conforming, but there were just a few of those. At the end, we still ended with this predominantly red or maroon color parcels rather than green. In terms of setbacks, the front setbacks, there were most districts were within or very near the required setback for most analyzed blocks. So the front placement of most buildings were pretty much at the right setback or very close, just slightly off. And we'll see that also in a minute on the graphic. One exception was in traditional older neighborhoods, and this is a very particular form for Richmond overall. The city normally has what we are identifying as primary streets that are parallel to the alleys, and then secondary streets where the alleys actually intersect. And most of the blocks of the city are oriented in a way that they front the primary street because they have an alley in the back, and there are very few amount of blocks that are fronting the secondary streets, with some exceptions. In traditional neighborhoods or older neighborhoods, those blocks that front in secondary streets tend to be smaller, and they tend to be at zero lot line or very close to it. So those parcels that we see highlighted here in red, and this is the photo of one of those in the Jackson Ward block number 1. Those are the examples where the front setback is way off from the requirement. So this is more an important thing to know for contextual allowance of for future setbacks, for future buildings and their required setbacks. Yeah, so this is the front setbacks. Overall, the graphic, you can see it's mostly green with the except of in the R5 district. The Swansboro neighborhood, that one, it was very interesting that the northern half of the block was in conformity. You can see the top, these portions of green are both the opposing sides of the block on the northern end, and then the further south we were going on the block, suddenly we got a nonconformity, which is, it just speaks of a pattern of development in that neighborhood. But overall, the other districts are very close to it. These groups of red are those that I spoke of, these like secondary streets fronting. Those are like, it became very easy to identify once we grouped them together, which it's always nice when the graph, when the data representation is that clear. And then the R7, there's less, it's less of a green and more of like a maroon because we're under, especially on Oregon's, this is for Oregon Hill, is the buildings that are mostly the attached typology that exists in the neighborhood. So these block, the set of a block fronting Laurel Street has most of an attached typology that it was closer to the street, and the other half of the block on, I think it was Cherry Street, that one had a more of a detached typology of buildings, so that's why we had less nonconformity on the front. Now the most exciting one is the size setbacks. Minimum setbacks were frequently infringed across the analyzed block, especially in our older neighborhoods. Buildings patterns in historical neighborhoods is particularly misaligned to the required setbacks, and really depends a lot on the subsections and the zoning to become either conforming or being allowed to be just to explain how they're functioning. So one is that attached buildings are allowed to have narrower building fronts and therefore narrower setbacks on one of their sides. But in many cases, even detached buildings, like these ones show here on the Sambor map, the historical Sambor map, and then in this photo, buildings, detached buildings still sit on the zero lot line of the property line, meaning that they have no side setback on one of their sides, and the setback only happens on the opposite end. So that means that every one of those buildings had non-conforming size setbacks for the side that is built right at the lot line. So yeah, and this happens in the R6, R7, and R63 districts. So pretty much historical denser neighborhoods. In some cases, it was really hard to define and determine which lot owned which yard when we were doing the visual assessment. And you'll see that in a minute on the graphic. So these are every single block. Again, every column is a block for R5, R4, R5, R6, R7, and R63 districts. And you can tell how the R6 is particularly in non-compliance. Even after we adjusted, and those there's a few cells in these graphics that have a grayed out number. Normally it's a 0 number. Those were 0 size setbacks for attached buildings that were removed from nonconformity because being attached to each other, obviously they cannot be, and there won't be a size setback, and that's fine per zoning. So we manually adjusted that depending on which of the buildings. But we were still like, it was still a lot of cases where the buildings were at 0 lot line or under 3. In this big chunk of this part of the it's actually a museum. It's a museum district parts, block number 1. It was a lot of properties where detached houses that clearly one was built at property line, and so the other side setback was the 3-foot setback. We couldn't determine who owned which side from the images that we had, and even from the time I was there. So that's why they have it's either between 0 or 3. But still, it creates this non-conformity situation. Finally, rear setbacks very occasionally infringe for accessory structures. As you can tell, again, those parcels fronting the so-called secondary streets. In general, mostly in compliance, we adjusted for the buildings, especially accessory buildings, especially in the R6 and R7 or R60C district that had accessory structures at the 0 lot line because they have an exception. In the R5 and R4 districts, only the accessory structures that were not within the required 5 feet from the alley were still infringing their rear setback, but there were some cases which also could mean with an actual physical survey of the parcel might mean that some of our measurements might be off by 1 feet. So I wouldn't read too much into having some nonconformities there. So this is an overall summary of those setbacks. Again, you can tell size setback is where Code Studio will have more fun to work with when determining what is a healthy setback on the side for each of the districts. And the last takeaway is what I mentioned, that the property type does have a drastic influence to conformity in parcels for in the parcels from the R6, R7, R63 districts, and likely, although we didn't have any R8, R43, and others. And as you can tell on the 3 graphics on the bottom, the one on the left is the actual property types from a portion of that Jackson Ward Block 1. If we had defined all of them as a single family detached, as we did for the neighborhood analysis, we had an increase on the amount of red, because now they are all required to be bigger parcels and wider parcels. But if we had defined all of them as single family attached, then everything becomes green, because a single family attached allows for, instead of 5,000, it's a 2,200 square feet parcel. Instead of 50 feet wide, it's 16. So suddenly everything becomes conforming. So this is the game that happens in these particular districts. And that will be all on my end. I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah.
I'm just unmuting.
Oh, thank you, Carlos. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, that was an incredible amount of research and analysis. And I know it's taken, but I do want to open the floor for questions from the advisory council. We'll dive into this next week or next month, excuse me, but if there are things that you want to ask while it's fresh. Phil, okay.
You go ahead, Charlie.
That's more of a comment.
Okay.
Well, I'll ask the question. So you picked 14 blocks. Why did you pick these 14? And I imagine this is going to inform a conclusion or recommendation at some point.
Yeah.
Do you feel comfortable that 14 that you picked are representative of the areas, the broader areas? But again, my initial question is why these 14 blocks?
So first, we tried to have at least one block that based on the overall, when we were looking at the at a map like this one, where you can see the footprints that look the most common type of collection of buildings in that area. In some cases where, like, for example, in Jackson Ward, block number 2 is split between R6 and R63. We thought that was it was a good idea to add another block just to see if there was a change between the parcels that are in the R63 or the R6. We also tried to cover, had a block that included more building types. So if there, let's say in Oregon Hill, that was one of the choices. For example, one of the blocks that we were considering it was a more regular, all attached buildings on both sides of the block, versus the block that we end choosing had a more diverse set of building forms. So that in a way, there's also a possibility when we go block by block to see which property types and how they relate to their other conformity or non-conformity. So to see, let's say, if by being an urban, detached urban or semi-detached house, if being two family or single family, how it creates a pattern on that row or doesn't. So we try to maximize blocks that look like this, like a more rainbow of building typologies and character. To that said, I agree, this is just a test of blocks, and it allows us to start some potential further analysis, even if considered like which blocks seem like, okay, this seems like particularly non-conforming or drastic. It could potentially require looking more in depth, but overall we try to be fair in the parameters I just mentioned.
Thank you.
Charlie?
Yeah, I guess building off of that, wanted to commend you for doing such a exhaustive job of trying to quantify something that is extremely difficult to quantify and give us a really good groundwork for existing conditions. That's kind of step one in any solid planning exercise for the existing conditions. I'll be curious to see where the conversation collectively goes as we like try to determine what zoning districts are and where they're applied. I feel like there's going to be some good conflict and good conversation about, okay, are we trying to mimic existing development patterns, or are we trying to answer for other needs, like the housing shortage, for instance? To theoretically, there will be some, I guess, within that conversation that I'm curious to see where it goes, and I think we can have based on data like this. So appreciate it.
Wrinkle that actually will make it rather difficult to replicate exactly the patterns that we see there, but they actually in the old days had ways of dealing with it, and that has to do with the fact that the building code requires a 3-foot setback opposite any wall that has windows in it. And a lot of these buildings, especially in the areas where the building is against the side on one side, it has a 3-foot yard plus or minus on the other side. And you'll see that pattern just replicate all the way down the block. And often those building walls have windows. Back in the 70s, I did a lot of research on the lot line issue that they weren't able to do without doing the deed research. And in fact, those lot lines almost always are against the building that, in other words, if there's a 3-foot separation between buildings, it's against the wall on one side. And what they did in the deeds, and it's actually one in my deed, is there's a provision that if you have one of these lots, you are required to preserve that 3-foot space on the side of your lot to protect the rights of the adjacent property owner if they have windows along there. And I've done a lot of looks at these deeds, and unfortunately, sometimes those provisions, when new deeds are issued, they drop out. I don't know how that happens. But anyway, the bottom line is that under current law, we can't replicate that pattern unless the walls have no windows. And unless you've got a really short house, that's almost impossible to do. So that's just a fact of life. It's going to feed into what we're able to do. But of course, keep in mind that almost all these neighborhoods are already fully developed. And I missed the very important last meeting, but before that, it was pointed out how there really aren't that many opportunities to do infill because of the fact that the city is so already fully developed and the market's strong enough to protect the existing development so that people aren't going to go in and just mow down rows of houses. So That's why it's really important for us to concentrate on where the opportunities do exist and hear what we come up with to work best with those opportunities instead of thinking that we're going to be able to replicate patterns that we really can't replicate. At least not exactly the same way.
A great point. Thank you, Roger. Damien?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a sort of bigger picture question about how this fits into the overall, process here. Because, we knew going into this that it was kind of generally understood that the existing zoning did not reflect existing development patterns in our historic neighborhoods, and that created a lot of non-conforming uses. And it's interesting to see that, parsed out to this level of detail. But then, how does that then inform next steps as we go about, creating new zoning districts?
Maybe we can answer that question.
Well, you'll see a little bit of that in our presentation,
Okay.
but I think we're still working that through with Carlos. As as he's preparing information.
I guess I don't mean,
You spend a little more time analyzing his work, but
but what's why do we ask him to do this? Like, what?
so it can inform the zoning
So
we come up with.
yeah, so the metrics that appear in the zoning should accommodate the existing condition as much as possible in historic neighborhoods. Understanding that there's, also fire code issues that can't be accommodated anymore, but at least in terms of zoning, that it could accommodate that. And so we talk about, setbacks, and all these other metrics, lot sizes and so forth, that we're setting numbers that allow the kind of existing condition to be considered to be conforming. So if somebody wants to, if there is an opportunity to build another similar building to the ones that are existing there, or if a building gets torn down and somebody wants to replace it for some reason, or alteration to their building, they don't have to go through a kind of convoluted process because they're considered to be out of conformity. So that's the intention, and I understand the
I guess I get it now. So it's, framing it in terms of, we're looking at the characteristics of these lots, right? And framing them in terms of how they relate to the existing zoning. But really it sounds like the main point of it is to sort of understand what those characteristics are in the first place so that the subsequent zoning can conform.
So,
yeah, probably one of the first things we do once we start actually getting to the point of mapping will be to map the new zones on these same blocks that Carlos has tested, and then we can sort of see, are we doing a better job? There probably will still be some oddballs that just don't fit for some reason because there's always going to be some unusual plots, but if we can get most of them conforming, I think that will be.
If we're seeing from Carlos's work that front setbacks are 10 feet, for example, 10 feet minimum, we don't want to go and set a front setback of 15 feet minimum.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, probably front setbacks is the easiest one to connect to this work to the future zoning. In part because it was mostly within or near to, but it gives you an idea. For example, the R7 district in Oregon Hill, except for a very few cases, this entire street was at 11 feet, right? So you can start seeing like patterns where all the buildings were a certain number, and right now the minimum is 15, right? So it start giving some numbers to play with and for CoStudio to determine, okay, what's the minimum or maximum front setback that we should be allowing on different districts.
Thanks.
Do we have any additional questions before we continue on with the presentation? Are you continuing with the second part, or are we turning this over to Renee? Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so what we're going to talk about, we've just heard the pattern presentation framework, giving you an overview of the conceptual zoning districts, and then we'll kind of do a really steps. And if we have time, we've got some discussion questions for you. You may also have questions for us. If we don't get those discussion questions today, we'll have a much more fulsome chance to discuss in December, as Marianne said. I also would encourage you to take a look at the questions and think about them next month. You want to ask. the things basically that you wanted a little bit of input from you that help fill us in on a few of the districts. What are we proposing here? And I'm just going to say, first of all, this is still very preliminary. These districts can change, and we're basically putting them in front of you just to kind of put something on the ground and try to workshop them with you. I think that would be really interested to hear your feedback. I think as we kind of keep playing with these, the number of them might change. We might add a few more, we might remove some. As was said, I think that part of the goal here is to also try and get these in closer conformity to the kind of analysis that Carlos has done, at least with respect to those neighborhoods that he went over. The metrics that you'll see presented in this presentation are not complete. They're only certain ones. So for example, I think we don't have setbacks yet. We're basically just giving you kind of a few standards that kind of define each one of these districts so we can put something in front of you. As we kind of go forward, we're going to be adding more standards. And some of those require more kind of discussion and engagement with the work that Carlos has done. So what have we put out here? Here's the kind of the basic set of zoning districts that we're putting forward for discussion today. These are, again, the approach to all this is to try and start as simple as possible. We really don't want to have too many districts that duplicate. So we're trying to start as simply as we can. It may turn out through the course of discussion that some of these may need to be bifurcated further. We might need to add more to accommodate certain types of conditions that fall in between them or whatnot. But this is just the starting point. And we've grouped them in these different categories here. So residential mixed use, commercial mixed use, industrial mixed use, industrial, institutional, and civic and open space. These have a relationship to the Richmond 300 land use categories. They're not a direct relationship, but I'll show you. Here's the Richmond 300 land use categories across the bottom, and kind of here's how these kind of connect together. And so these are not completely nested. So there's going to be some districts that fall into more than one land use category. Well, particularly when we get to like the commercial mixed use ones and the residential mixed use, there's a lot of kind of mixing around. Some of these again, to try and save space, we're not completely nesting each one of these groups within a land use category. We're trying to kind of allow or create a set of districts that could work within multiple categories. When we get to some of the more specialized ones like industrial, it's more of a closer to a one-to-one relationship. The nomenclature here, and there's some questions more about that. Again, this is just a sort of what seemed like a simple system to us, but we'll be interested to hear your feedback. The residential zones begin with R, and the different flavors of those are the letter at the end of them. So RA, RB, RC, RD. RDX is a sort of slightly more mixed version of RD. Residential mixed use are primarily residential, but allowing more mixed use opportunities. And whenever you see a number at the end of one of these names, it refers to the number of stories, the maximum number of stories. There's a 3-story residential mixed use and a 5-story. For commercial mixed use, that's your general mixed use category that allows a whole variety of different uses, residential, office, retail, so forth. Those range in height from 3 stories all the way up to an unlimited one, which will be applied probably downtown only. Industrial mixed use, we have sort of a similar range from 3 stories up to 13 stories. Again, not sure if we need all of those necessarily, but it's maybe a bit, we might look at ways to kind of consolidate some of those industrial mixed use ones to make it a bit simpler. For industrial, an A and a B, there's 2 different flavors related to how intense it is. An institutional district for civic uses and 2 different open space districts. And we'll get into the details of those in a sec. So what does this mean? So we're going to go through each one of these quickly on a slide here. We have the category on top that they fall into up here that I just went over. The proposed name of the district. In a few cases, we just kind of bundled a few up together on one page. Similar existing zoning districts, just looking at your existing zoning. This isn't an exhaustive analysis, but a few that these do kind of relate to, I think. And keep in mind that we're going to be remapping the city as well as updating the zoning. So it's not as if we're just going to do a one-to-one switcheroo for existing zoning. Some of them may go in different directions, but there will be a certain kind of relationship between some of those. The general description of what we think this is going to be about and which of the implementing Richmond 300 land use categories this would fall into. And as you saw, a lot of them fall into more than one. So this commercial mixed use one of 8, 13, and unlimited stories falls anywhere from community, maybe a little bit to corridor to destination to downtown. And the sample image here and a few basic metrics. So those are the metrics here we put out. Again, these are just the kind of initial set of metrics to give you a flavor of what these districts might be like. There would be more added as we go forward. So those metrics are standards, just to kind of go through them quickly with you before we put these districts on the screen. Minimum site and lot area. So this is quite simply the minimum size of a property that you're allowed to have within this district. And lot width, the minimum width. So whether it's a large site or a small site. Units per building. So again, referring to residential units here. What's the maximum number of units are allowed inside a building? Some of these numbers relate to the plan, loosely at least. So identifying how many units we allow in each one of these areas. And it could happen in two different ways. We could be talking about units within a single building, as in the left-hand side, or we could be talking about group of massing building height and width. So what's the maximum height? Pretty straightforward in terms of stories. We may add more refinements later on, aligning those stories to a particular number of feet so you don't get odd things, but just talking stories for now. And then how wide a building can be. What's the maximum length for a building without some sort of break or significant articulation? So whether we're talking one building or we're talking many buildings. The setback distance here. So you've heard lots about setbacks already. There's a front setback. There's also side and rear setbacks. In the presentation right now, we're just focusing on front setbacks. The front setback coming from the public street, whether on the primary street or the side street. The build to area. So this is kind of the flip side of the setback. So this is sort of the setback is saying you have to be set back by a certain minimum. This is sort of saying here's a maximum you can be away. So you could express it as a minimum and maximum setback too, if you like. But basically saying that you're not allowed to build your building too far away from the street. And this is particularly a concern in more commercial areas where you have trying to avoid, highly suburban type buildings that are set way back from the street. But here's the minimum maximum put together. And effectively, your front of your building has to fall somewhere within this zone. And there's a percentage as well too. So a certain percentage of the front will have to fall within it. You'll be able to have a smaller percentage step back or have gaps that are allowed to break this. Here's applied over a building. Parking location, fairly straightforward here. We're not talking about numbers of parking units or parking spaces anymore, of course, but we're talking about where it's located. So whether or not you are allowed to put parking to the front of the side or it has to be at the back. In urban areas, we want to try and keep it away from as much as possible. If you do a back parking lot or you access your parking through an alley. So going through the districts here, so I'm going to start with what we call the residential grouping. Again, we might change some of these names as we go forward. These are not all strictly residential. There are some other uses in there, but these are ones that sort of lean towards the residential side. They would probably fall, when we map them, into certainly predominantly into the residential and the neighborhood mixed use categories, to a lesser extent, some of them into the community mixed use and corridor mixed use. So from the kind of least intensive, the manufactured home park, replacing your current RMH district. So these are basically these are intended to accommodate the smaller number of manufactured home areas that you have within the city limits right now. Pretty large minimum site area. The minimum width, again, these are sort of for a complete sort of lot that would have multiple buildings on them, rather than not speaking about individual buildings in a manufactured home park. Maximum height and fair enough freedom about location and parking. This one's pretty simple. RB, we're now calling residential neighborhood B, but again, we might tweak some of these names. This is one that we presented to you guys before. We talked a bit about largely replacing the current R1 and R2, which are the least intensive residential zones right now. And following standards that are similar to R2, I would say, generally speaking.
allowing so lower density housing of lots no less than 15,000 square feet, including single family attached and ADUs. And I would also say that we're suggesting at the moment to include duplexes or two family units within this area. Again, this is maybe for discussion today. We've raised this before and it seemed like there was a positive feeling from the group, but again, want to sort of feel this out. It's something that is not explicitly called for in Richmond 300. Or if we're going too far or not, but thinking that if you're already having ADUs, duplexes might be okay here. Again, there's still a minimum, fairly substantial minimum lot size and lot width, units per building, 2 in this case, maximum stories, 3. Front setback minimum of 25 feet, and parking location could be front, side, or rear. You're less urban residential neighborhood. And then going to the sort of the denser ones here. So this is going at the moment RC, residential neighborhood C, replacing R3, R4, and R5. Again, may not be exactly replaced one-to-one on the map, but more or less kind of taking standards from these areas and sort of leaning towards the kind of more dense end of that towards the R5. So moderate density housing on lots no less than 5,000 square feet, including single family attached duplexes, again, question mark, and ADUs. So minimum lot size, 5,000 square feet, minimum lot width, 50 feet, maximum height of 3 stories, up to 2 units per building, and a minimum front setback of 15 feet. Parking should be located at the side or the rear. So we're not in these areas hoping to try and get, and it could be accessed from a rear lane where that exists, or that can be located to the side of the building rather than in a front yard. Up to residential neighborhood D. So this is somewhat comparable to 6 or 7 or 8. This is, I guess, would serve at least 2 purposes. So it would be for the edges. If you remember the conversations we had before about the edges of the residential land use area in Richmond 300, where their residential areas are abutting a major street, the plan greater intensity there. So allowing up to potentially small apartment buildings. So for this area here, and then the other kind of dual use of it would be for the interior of neighborhood mixed use areas. So again, your sort of classic urban neighborhoods. So this is a sort of a more dense residential district, allowing single family detached, duplexes, townhouses or attached dwellings, stacked townhouses, and small apartments. We've set up to 12 units. There's some discussions about typical numbers of units and they get architecturally built in a small walk-up building. Plan said 10 is a maximum, so not sure if 12 is going too far, but that's what we've put out here for now. We're not suggesting any minimum lot size or lot width for these. And again, this is another item for discussion. Part of the reason behind this is to avoid the tremendous levels of nonconformity that Carlos has raised already. We also don't think that because a lot of the areas these get applied in have a kind of history of narrow lots. I mean, there's a physical limitation to how narrow of a building you can build. I don't think there's great offense that could happen if somebody built a narrower building here. That is a way that basically kind of instantly clears up all those nonconformities. Units per building up to 12, so we allow up to the sort of small scale apartment buildings you see through some of the historic neighborhoods of the city in the neighborhood mixed use area. Height up to 4 stories. Again, not sure if we need to have a 3-story version of that, or it's 4. 4 stories would accommodate a typical stacked townhouse where you have 2 units on top of each other, which is one of the typologies we're thinking about. Building width, maximum length of 125 feet. So you can't have super long apartment buildings, even if they're limited in height. Front setback between 10 and 15 feet, which I think is pretty common for these areas. There might be some exceptions. Build to minimum 75%. So that means that 75% of the building's frontage has to fall within that 10 to 15 foot setback. You have a 25% of that could fall somewhere else behind that. Parking location should be at the rear. So again, we're talking about areas that predominantly have rear alleys. A different version of this is just a sort of slightly different flavor of it that would allow some mixed uses. So we had this discussion before about historic neighborhoods that have mixed-use buildings in them. Not sure if this should be applied to all these areas, but maybe more selectively to some parts of them. So similar metrics, but allowing small commercial units of up to 2,500 square feet on the ground floor. So small neighborhood cafes, maybe even offices, that sort of thing. And then one final one here, and apologies, it's probably not a great image, but this is one sort of special characteristic here. So low to mid-rise housing with large front setbacks, including single attached duplexes, townhouses, stacked townhouses, and apartments. I think in this case here, this is more of a kind of apartment zone, but thinking particularly about some areas where there's a character of a deep front setback. So unlike these more urban areas where it's more of a 10 to 15 foot setback, here we're talking 20 feet minimum. I'm thinking particularly about places like Chamberlain, where you have these apartment buildings set back behind large landscaped areas. Potentially, we're thinking about what gets applied around the outside of the residential areas. Again, the main street frontages. This is also a potential zone that could be used there. Say along some of those frontages, we want to maintain a kind of more green character. So then going ahead to the more mixed use ones here, we've kind of grouped these into residential and commercial mixed use. Maybe we just roll this together, or maybe we use different terminology there. Some of them are more residential, open to greater variety. So looking through these, what we call residential mixed use 3 and 5 right now. These are replacing largely your kind of multifamily zones, the R 2-digit zones. And the intent here is for, again, low to medium intensity housing with limited ground floor commercial uses. It's a little bit more commercial potential than the RDX that we showed back here, which is limited to 2,500 square feet. So in this case here, it would be the entire ground floor could be commercial, but an individual unit would be limited to 2,500 square feet. So you could have a building with, again, sort of a fully commercial ground floor. And you are not allowed to do a fully commercial building unless you have to have residential. So 2 different flavors here, a 3-story flavor and a 5-story flavor. Again, with maximum lengths limited to 125 feet and 175 feet. No minimum lot sizes. Again, there's a lot of different types of buildings you could build here. Front setbacks between 5 and 15 feet. Of which 75% of the building has to fall within that area. Parking location should be at the rear or the side, or in the case of a 5-story building, could have structured parking as well. And then going on to these other uses here. So these are kind of replacing your UB and B zones right now. So these ones here, low, medium, and high to very high intensity buildings. The scale. These allow for a whole variety of different types of buildings: row houses, apartments, offices, restaurants, hotels, with ground floor retail, with office or residential above. So these are sort of truly mixed use. They could be a variety of different things. And again, a 3-story and a 5-story version with maximum building lengths, maximum and minimum setbacks, and real room parking location. Going further up here to kind of the most intensive commercial mixed uses, these are the ones that would be applied more along certain corridors, the destination mixed use area, and then only for the unlimited, only for the downtown mixed use. So the most intensive mixed use buildings, again, heights limited to 813 and unlimited, maximum building lengths, a variety of lengths there, setbacks, build to, and these would all be required to do structured parking. And then going to industrial mixed use and industrial next. Industrial mixed use, 3 and 5-story versions. So these are intended to accommodate a variety of residential and commercial and light industrial uses. Again, allowing row houses, apartments, ground floor retail and office, and residential above, and some larger industrial buildings, but limited to lighter uses. So a 3-story and a 5-story version. Maximum building lengths of 125 and 175 feet. Front setbacks in a range of between 5 and 15 feet.
build to, and an idea of where the parking would be. Going up to the most intense ones, and again, I'm not sure if we necessarily need all of these, but there are looking at the, how the zoning and the Richmond 300 overlap before. There are some areas that have industrial mixed use as a land use in Richmond 300 and have a TOD zoning right now. So making sure that we can accommodate that. That's why we had to kind of go all the way up to 13 stories. Again, we may look for opportunities to kind of consolidate some of these because there isn't a huge amount of the city covered by industrial mixed use. And then to the kind of the truly industrial districts, two different versions here, called IA and IB. So IA, industrial light, largely replacing the current M1. Not allowing residential and retail. There might be some accessory retail allowed, but not more than that. Allows heavier commercial uses, auto body shops, auto sales, auto paint facilities, outdoor storage, light manufacturing, warehousing, logistics, trucking, and distribution facilities. Not a whole lot of built form rules, which is typical for industrial areas. There is a maximum height, a fair amount of freedom around parking. The sort of constraints we put in here are more about limiting uses and perhaps limiting transitioning if they're abutting a residential area. Industrial heavy here. So these are areas that allow manufacturing activities and often the sort of the most kind of intense industrial activities that you've got. Some of them might have environmental impacts, so require special measures to ensure compatibility. Placing M2 largely. And then the very last ones here, the civic district here. So this is intended to replace institutional zoning right now. Still some question in our minds about how this, if this applies to all institutional areas or only over a certain size, or if we can split this up into two zones. There's maybe one that's more schools and one that's more bigger things like campuses. But basically it's designed to accommodate a variety of civic institutional uses that don't easily fit into other districts. So it could be things like schools, places of worship, city or county facilities, community centers, hospitals, museums, and libraries. I think we would allow smaller places of worship and smaller schools to appear in other districts, the residential ones and so forth. But these are thinking about things over a certain size. Again, a fairly limited number of metrics here right now. And then the last two, and again, this is sort of a new introduction. There's no current open space zoning in Richmond, but thinking about introducing these to kind of align to the public open space category in the plan, and just make mostly just for the sake of clarity. So when you look at the zoning map, you really understand where the open spaces are. Again, we're not expecting to constrain park design through these spaces. It's more just about kind of clearly indicating where parks like the open spaces are. So in this case here, OSA, the first type here is the intent here is to kind of create and preserve and enhance parkland and meet active recreational needs. And so we might expect things like playgrounds, ball fields, sports courts, trails, dog parks, and accessory facilities, things like community centers, libraries, and restrooms. This is the more active recreational one. And then finally, OSB, a more passive natural area. So basically to create and preserve, and it's designed to be permanent open space and meet passive recreational needs. These are intended to be occupied or to be unoccupied or predominantly unoccupied, at least by buildings or other impervious surfaces. So these are the kind of natural conservation areas, slopes in the river. Some of these might have hiking trails, but they would be again passive spaces that are more about natural conservation. So briefly about next steps, and then I think we've got quite a bit of time for discussion still. And just to kind of put this into context, that's a whole bunch of things that we've kind of thrown out in front of you really quickly. Some of these we're going to keep working on, or I guess all of them we're going to keep working on. We're going to be refining this as we go forward. So again, we want to just kind of put everything out in front of you right now, just so we have sort of see the lay of the land. In December, we're going to be Carlos is going to be presenting the building scale analysis, which is the last part of the pattern book, and we're going to have hopefully most of that meeting for a kind of in-depth workshop on these zoning districts that you've seen today. In January, the pattern book is going to be complete. There's going to be an opportunity for further discussion if there's any other questions about it. But at that point, it will be wrapping up.
there's going to be, again, an opportunity for further in-depth discussion and workshopping of these districts. And we're going to keep, tweaking them and refining them as we go forward. So there's some potential revision as we move forward. By the time we get to February, not sure what the Zach is going to discuss. It might be a continuation of the same thing, or it might be something new. But there's going to be a couple other events happening, including public houses to present the pattern book and the conceptual zoning district. So once we've had a chance to kind of workshop these and refine them further to you, we're going to put them out in a public meeting, people to take a look at and comment on. And then there's also events with a focus on housing happening then as well. And then starting in March, we're going to be moving into the more detailed zoning districts. So working on adding in all the kind of additional metrics that might be associated with these graphics, and also applying them on a zoning map. So we'll start the next phase of the project at that point. So that's a whole lot of stuff. I've got a few kind of general questions for you guys, but would also be happy to hear your questions to me.
To yours, if that's okay, Brian, and then
Yeah.
Damien.
Just, I might be getting too into the weeds here, but when you're going through the RX3 and RX5, I presume that second bullet point means that the individual commercial tenant spaces would be limited to 2,500 square feet.
That's right.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not saying there shouldn't be, but I'm not sure I understand why they would be limited. I mean, if you've got, say, 13,000 square feet of ground floor commercial and somebody needs 4,000 square feet of office space, why would it be limited to 2,500 square feet?
I'd be happy to kind of, tweak that. I don't think we're necessarily wedded to that number. I think the intent here was just to say that there is, a limit to kind of avoiding a very large scale commercial use in this area. So these are predominantly residential things that happen within community mixed use or even potentially neighborhood mixed use. Maybe there's a limit to the scale of the commercial enterprise that we want.
Yeah, we're trying to keep it like neighborhood scale, whatever that is, just so that it's not, a Walgreens or something which generates a significant amount of traffic.
There's some precedent for that in existing zoning, like R63 has a max. You can do corner commercial if you have the corner frontage. I think it's 1,000 square feet off the top of my head. But that's only attracting but so much retail or office or cafe type of uses. So the difference right now is that this one, I think I said this before, but this one would allow an entirely commercial ground floor, but units would be limited in size individually. Whereas this one back here limits the total amount of square footage. In one of these places.
It just seems to me that with retail and its state that it's in, and frankly, the Richmond office environment and the state that it's in, we're adding unnecessary handcuffs to the viability of commercial spaces.
Yeah, good point.
Damien, and then we're gonna get Preston, and then I'll come back to Bill.
Yeah, I have two things, one of which should be pretty quick. On the RD and RDX districts, I noticed, so we had a conversation in the last meeting about how, the number of units allowed should correspond to some sort of architectural standard about units per story. And which to me, I would understand to be like 4 units per story. So if it's 4 stories, shouldn't it be 16 units? Or if it's 12 units, shouldn't it be 3 stories?
Yeah, there might need to be 2 different versions of this. I think it was sort of accommodating 2 different things. I need to kind of iron that in. So I think the idea, it was partly about accommodating 4 units per story over 3 stories as one possibility. So a small apartment building, and then the other possibility would be stacked townhouses, which might be 4 stories. So it's 2-story. So I'm not sure if we need to sort of say is typologically specific, depending on which one you build, or we bifurcate the
I
zone.
think it's unlikely anybody's going to do a 12-unit 4-story building. Just
Well, I guess that was my
elevator in at that point. Assuming a 3-story 12-unit building and then a 4-story stacked town.
You mean like a 2 over 2 condo?
Yeah.
So we're I guess, kind of purposely not wanting a 4x4 building in this area, like a 16 unit.
Yeah,
Okay.
mainly because you can't do it for, like, you'd have to put in, developers wouldn't necessarily build it either, because you have to have like sprinklers and lots of stairs and elevators.
So this is like a sort of on the edge between single family and
Yeah.
other sort of smaller multi-unit things, whereas when you get to like this is like the true kind of multi.
Well, then, yeah, so then this is where my next question is, and more so on CX3 and IX3. Like, if these are designations that would exist in, community and corridor and above, future land use designations, why would we limit ourselves to 3? I feel like we should be in the types of areas that have those future land use designations. We should be, I don't think we need CX3 or IX3. I think 5 is a good sort of baseline.
Yeah, I think the intent here, again, I think if we applied on a map, it would be, we could probably have a better discussion about it, but it's more about, there might be some kind of, low, small community mixed use areas that are adjacent to neighborhoods where you want limits. Whereas when you get to the more intense ones like corridor and so forth, yeah, we're talking 5 at least. Depends on depth as well too. So some of the corridors, as I think we mentioned before, have like super deep lots, and some of them are super shallow. So there's kind of natural limitation to the height.
Preston, do you have a question?
I do. Thank you, Elizabeth. 2 questions. The first is related to, and I don't recall the name of the categories now, but the open space categories that you described at the tail end. I have no objection to this as a concept, but would suggest that there be some way to capture the fact that these are publicly owned properties. And the reason that there may be an initial knee jerk, like, well, maybe there are other properties that we want to preserve as open space. The challenge is that if it's privately owned and the city designates it as open space, which would effectively preclude the ability to pull a building permit for any viable use on that property, that's going to constitute a regulatory taking. Or at least I think there's a strong likelihood that it would. And so it's going to create some potential challenges to the rollout when we begin to figure out how we want to designate properties. And so I just sort of wanted to place that as a placeholder concept to think about for this particular designation, just because, as you said, it's not one that's currently reflected on the city zoning map. We don't have any equivalent to that concept.
Yeah, if I could just respond quickly, yeah, that's definitely our intention. We're not going to be randomly declare people's properties to be parks. The idea is basically to reflect the open space, public open space category in the plan. Now, that being said, we were taking a closer look at the mapping today. There are a couple of spaces where the public open space strays onto private property. So we did just be ready to tweak those. The other categories that are maybe on the edge are there's cemeteries, which are not city owned necessarily, but they fall under public open spaces. So do we need a separate cemetery zone? Different list? I'm not sure.
Or people only,
or do we, or is it just mentioned under the list of uses? And again, the only concern here, I don't think anybody's going to develop a cemetery or part of it. The only concern here would be, is there a public? I just want to look a little bit closer and see if there's public spaces that are, or open spaces that are owned by some other entity other than the city, which might be a public or nonprofit entity, but might not want to have its future opportunities constrained. So we need to take a look at that more carefully when we map it.
and we
For sure,
should we should
Sorry, go
ask
ahead.
ourselves. Maybe a private property owner might want to rezone their property to park or conservation. Should we allow that? Don't know.
Preston, did you have another question?
I did. Thank you. Sorry, I wanted to make sure I didn't interrupt. The second one had to do with the residential mixed use designation, and I'll just flag this as an observation. Having worked on a number of vertical mixed use kind of predominantly multifamily development opportunities where they were in an area that the zoning required some minimum size of non-residential use to activate the street front. And I certainly understand the planning concept here, but I wanted to make sure that I at least flagged the fact that when these are underwritten, when a developer puts together their pro forma, they have to basically assume that they're going to have zero income on the commercial side. An institutional lender is not going to be willing to assume that any portion of that commercial is necessarily going to be leased. It's a bonus. If they lease it, great, but effectively it's taking away from the ability of the lender to figure out what's the income coming in once the project is stabilized. And so the bigger that number is, the bigger the requirement for non-residential uses, the more difficult these are going to be to finance from the private lending side. And so again, I just wanted to flag that concept as food for thought.
So Marita has a follow-up there, but also the way it's written, it says the entire ground floor could be commercial,
Yes,
so it's not as if.
just to clarify, yeah, so residential mixed use is supposed to be a multifamily district that allows for commercial up to a certain scale. It doesn't require you to do any commercial there. So these could be, this, I would imagine in most cases, this would be a fully residential building, allowing up to a certain amount. Now,
Okay, much more
Nothing
user friendly.
we're proposing is going to require anybody to do any kind of mixed use.
So even the commercial mixed use areas, I think as they're currently conceived, would allow you to build a, fully residential tall building downtown if you wanted to.
Do you have something, Marita?
Yeah, I had a different comment. And I think your instinct is right. We probably don't need industrial mixed use 8 and 13 and the other one. I think it's just like, but we'll see that as we map, because I can't imagine places where you'd really want to continue to allow the light industrial uses, and then you'd also be going to 13 stories. Like, I don't know if that would really be happening
And where
in the same place.
Probably not, yeah. Yeah. I mean, when we take a look at the maps, we'll see, but yeah.
And then my second comment is on, I don't really, as a person who lives 2.5 blocks from where this unfortunate stretch of Chamberlain exists in our city, I'm not sure that I want to preserve the 20-foot minimum. But that's just.
That's what I was thinking when I saw the picture. Also used to live close. Philip?
Yeah, two things. Well, you're probably going to ask us about duplexes, so I hold my comments on that. But I don't know much about industrial, but we have industrial light, industrial heavy, and industrial light residential and retail is not allowed. Is there really a health and safety reason not to allow residential and retail and industrial light areas? I mean, if you look at Scott's Addition, many of these uses were until very recently, they're juxtaposed with residential and some retail and restaurants. So we have a precedent of that, and that's a likely area where there might be other Scott's Addition areas that are light industrial that could evolve into something.
Well, to me,
With
to me,
more
that's
residential.
sort of a Richmond 300 issue, in the sense that a lot of areas that currently have industrial zoning were kind of changed to industrial mixed use in Richmond 300. So that should be accommodated there. Presumably, there was a decision made to leave some areas as strictly industrial because that wasn't wanted there. I'm not sure, but that's
So,
yeah.
the problem is if you have an industrial area and you start allowing residential in, residential will outcompete industrial. So over time, you will lose your industrial land. And so as a city, at some point, if you keep allowing that, you will have no industrial land left. And my guess, that was the thinking.
Is it? Was that the thinking?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, and I would add to that, while it's okay to like live near an auto body shop or outdoor storage or some of this logistics stuff, it means that you have a lot of trucks moving through your neighborhood, and like streets should be designed to accommodate that truck movement. So you don't necessarily want to like encourage that right next to each other.
We even heard that in the planning commission case probably 5 or 6 years ago, where the actual trucking company, I think it might have been SD, said, we're not going to make good neighbors. Our trucks are going to be coming in and out 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't know if it was SD, so I should have said
Yeah.
that, but
Yeah,
they're very loud and
they're backing up all the
Yeah.
time and.
I was just thinking of the Scouts Edition example being one that sort of felt like it. You could accommodate both,
Yeah, Scouts Edition is no longer industrial.
not happy. So.
I'm gonna get you, but Casey. Wait,
Yeah.
sorry,
thanks.
Phyllis, were you done? I apologize.
Okay.
And then Casey.
Yeah, similar to other questions, I was wondering, other than convention, what was the rationale behind the unit maximums for R, A, B, and C?
So I think that, so for our, well, RA is the mobile or manufactured home part. So it's, by nature, these are usually 1 unit each. For RB, this was, this is basically a single family district, but we're kind of floating the idea of allowing 2-family or duplexes here. So we're pushing a little bit further, and we'd like to, hear comment on that. So that's 2 at the moment. And then for RC, same deal, basically. So it's replacing, existing single family districts, but, considering pushing it a bit further. For RD, this is areas, again, the 12 units is maybe debatable, but thinking about what the plan said, allowing rented up to 10 units in buildings around the peripheries of residential area in the plan, and within the neighborhood mixed use area.
Okay, that makes sense. I was just wondering if a homeowner is interested in parceling out their own property further than what this allows, like, could there be space made for that? But yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's long, if you have a giant property and you want to subdivide, you still
Yeah,
meet
like,
the
I mean,
minimum lot
RV.
size, you can do that.
Yeah.
I think she's suggesting, is there any way to do more than 2 units in RB? Is that kind of what you're?
Yeah.
Like, should we be pushing for more? And
We had a concept before that we floated that we could bring back again, which was like allowing the sort of bonus for kind of extra small lots, as long as you were like limiting your development to a certain square footage and footprint area. And so it was basically saying that if you subdivide your lot into, if you build enough units, and they're very small, you could build sort of these kind of tiny houses, but small houses, let's say. And that would be allowed. So we could bring that back again as a concept. That would have been in the RB area as a kind of bonus.
I'd be curious to know how many lots something like this could even apply to, because a lot of these I would imagine are very built out neighborhoods. So unless you're tearing down, it's probably, yeah. And I would suspect living in a neighborhood like this is where you'll get the most pushback for smaller lots or duplexes. So it'd be interesting to know if this would even be a huge
I
opportunity.
think that was basically the kind of economic analysis that we did before that suggested, probably not a lot of uptake on allowing that within these areas. To me, the best opportunity for that is that maybe there are some areas in the south of the city where there's very big, almost rural lots that, have an opportunity to be subdivided.
you might see a secondary unit show up in a backyard.
Like an ADU.
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe it's a bigger ADU, maybe it's not
Right.
500 square feet, so
Yeah, right now your ADUs are limited to
500 square feet.
or 30% of the
1/3.
third of the. Yeah, you get at least 500 feet, but you can. So if you allow this, you could split your existing house into 2 units, 50-50.
I'm gonna get Wayne.
Yes. I got 2 questions. I'm looking at industrial mix, going back to this conversation, industrial mixed use districts. And everything you are allowing, or we're thinking about allowing light industrial, but then it's still industrial light. What constitutes having light industrial in one spot, but then not where there is residence and then not in the other? That's my first question.
Yeah, there might be some, when we kind of get down to the details, there might be different types of light industrial. So, or there might be size would be limited or something like that. So I would say that like, a small light industrial use would be fine in these areas. there could be, I mean, I think just generally speaking, the idea is that we need, the intent behind this IA and IB is that we need to preserve some land for strictly industrial uses. I would guess that industrial mixed use is kind of a transitional area. So let's say there's some industrial stuff that wants to continue to exist there and maybe even expand a little bit. We're going to allow that at the same time as allowing residential and retail to move into those areas. Probably in the long term, these areas will move in a residential direction if we're allowing that. But it allows over, a few decades or whatever ahead of kind of trend.
Gotcha, and that's why I'm asking, because I went to a civic league meeting about last month that was in an industrial mixed use space. And it didn't look like that beautiful building right there. And what happens is the residents were saying that they don't have a store around them for groceries, like simple needs. And according to, I guess, what was told to them, it wasn't attractive for a store or those kind of things to be built in their space because they're labeled as industrial. And so I am curious about the labeling. And what does that mean down the line for, yes, for residents, but also for them to have what they need. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, I think that it's clear that the retail would be allowed within these areas, so we're definitely not prohibiting grocery stores or whatever from being built. So yeah, I wonder if we can think about this some more, because a lot of these districts, these industrial mixed use are actually very similar to the commercial mixed use. We're basically just allowing some industrial uses there. So maybe it's some sort of a kind of, version or add-on to the commercial mixed use, rather than calling it out separately.
I think what I heard Wayne saying was, it's not about not allowing the residential, it's about some outside, company looking at the area and saying, oh, I don't want to locate here because the assumption is it's industrial, not
Right.
realizing there's residents there. Is that,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, I'm just saying maybe in terms of the nomenclature, we could make it less industrial sounding.
Damien and then Roger.
No, we can move on, although I do like that last comment was just made about if it's industrial mixed use, then the word industrial itself kind of seems like maybe there's a different word for it.
Yeah, Roger and then Charlotte.
People that develop these things are pretty sophisticated. I think they probably look beyond a name when they're deciding to do their analysis about whether they're willing to locate. They're going to locate where there's a market. A couple of things. One thing to, I think, keep in mind is that politically, it might be a lot easier to kind of sneak through some modifications to the ADU requirements rather than an outright duplex that's going to shake up a lot of people. And something I would point out, in the two cases where lawsuits have been going forward in Charlottesville and Alexandria and Arlington about allowing the duplexes in all zones, one of which has already been successful, it was on procedural basis. And I think it might be important to point out that we don't have anybody on this committee who's representative of a suburban civic association or a civic association president. And that might bite us, I think, if we're not careful about how we go forward with it. But anyway, one thing I wanted to mention that I've been going back and forth with Renee on, and he suggested I bring up, has to do with stuff that we'll get to in the future, but I think it's worth mentioning now, and that is lot coverage, open space, green space requirements. Right now, we haven't talked about doing anything. And some of these districts basically allow you to, except for building code, to go lot line to lot line with development. And one of the things in the master plan is this issue about hotspots and the fact that, especially in poorer neighborhoods, the temperatures in the summer can be as much as 10 degrees hotter than in cooler areas of the city. And the master plan suggestions all deal with public efforts to try to improve that. And yet there are things that can require of private developers as well, if we got into this issue of impervious surfaces and open space. And the other angle of that might make a difference in dealing with density issues, I calculated that in the RD district, that you could actually approach 100 units per acre if there were no setback requirements. You did it 12 unit, 4-story building. course, that'd be 3 per floor. Anyway, whatever. And yet supplemental regulations, when you start dealing with the details things, that's going to pull that down to a more reasonable level. So I think the question that it raises is, can we deal with that huge, probably inappropriate potential with the supplemental regulations, like open space setbacks, or would it be better to come up with another district that we plug in between C and D?
Yeah, so.
I'm sort of, from the discussions we've had, I'm kind of leaning towards, we could probably do it with the supplementals. But because the chances of somebody actually doing a density project of that density are pretty remote.
Yeah. I mean, so I think it could be both. I mean, I think that especially when we get to the more intensive districts, we haven't gone into this yet, but we probably are going to talk about some sort of open space requirement for them. Or at least an open space incentive for these, because we don't want this to be completely hard. We want to have some open spaces.
Anyway,
We need to be mindful, I'm sorry, of the open space is, unless it is maintained by the city, somebody, once the developer sells and moves out, someone has to maintain that.
like owner occupied properties.
Right, but someone has to maintain that, and we're talking about affordable housing, and then there is a cost for maintaining that. Does it get created? Do you create an HOA, and then there's another added cost for
No, I'm
HOA
talking about
fees?
it's on an individual lot, you've got a yard, and that yard alone is going to benefit the issue.
Yeah, and so I mean, other questions here, like I think what you're suggesting is that I think you said it's a bit of a jump from RC to RD.
I'm very
So here we're
familiar with
talking
that.
2
Very
units.
familiar with that building, and that's
12 units.
density wise, that's an extraordinarily intense building. And I think we'd probably all agree that you wouldn't want whole blocks developed just with buildings like that, all abutting each other. But from a practical point of view, that's not going to happen because of the areas pretty much all developed. It might more so if that RD zoning is imposed, and this means we need to look at the maps when we start talking about these districts and not look at them, not consider them without looking at, well, where could somebody do this? And then we look around and then start doing testing against those lots that might help us refine the district.
For next time, we could maybe apply zoning to some of the blocks that Carlos has looked at. Maybe.
We'll see. I mean, we're going to get there eventually.
Thinking out loud, but that
I mean, that doesn't mean that we
I don't want to scare anybody.
sometime in the future that after we come up with some things that look pretty good and then we get into the testing phase, that's part of the scientific method. And then go back and say, well, maybe we need to tweak this some more. Nothing preventing us from doing that.
No, of course not. And we certainly very likely will do that. So we might even have to add another district or something. We start mapping, we realize something. But the point is to try and just, at this point, before we get to too much mapping, sort of just think about what that way of districts.
Also like to comment on what Charlie said about how impressed I am with the incredible amount of work and analysis and detail you guys have gone through. I used to have to do stuff like that, and I had to do it the hard way.
Charlie.
Yes, small potatoes, but maybe an important detail that could come up maybe in supplemental regulations shows up in where you're saying parking location in some of these mixed use districts. And I understand the intent saying needs to be in a structure as in underground below a building, et cetera. But let's imagine a future where developers are like, yeah, we don't need parking in our large apartment building, which zoning currently doesn't allow for them to do that. They're just not doing it currently. It's like, oh, do I have to have parking at all? And it's going to be like, oh, if I opt to do some parking, I'm going to not do it because I don't want to pay for the structure. Like, let's say I've got a 100-unit building and it's like, oh, I could really benefit from 10 spaces for that, like just off the alley somewhere or something.
Yeah.
Does that need to be in a structure? So like,
no.
So maybe there's a way of threading the needle. Like,
we limit number of spaces outside of the structure.
yeah, like maybe 10%, you could do no more than 10% of total units as parking spaces, or I don't know, just something to keep in mind is necessitating a structure for an otherwise small amount of parking. Should someone only want to do a small amount of parking? That
wasn't the intent.
Yeah.
So
it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, following up on something Roger said, if we could go back to our right there, the comment about would we want to see blocks of those types of apartment buildings on the bottom right picture there abutting each other. And we do have that in the museum district now, which is zoned R6 or R7, I forget. So if there's a concern that the jump from C to D is too abrupt, say that the solution should be to, go up to 4 units in C or something like that, rather than,
That development is what triggered the city adopting its first zoning ordinance to stop it, 1927.
it's not just one thing. There's at least 3
A beautiful
blocks in with,
Yeah, that's right from Grove.
yeah, the 3100 block of Patterson, 3000 block of both, Patterson and Park.
And a lot of stuff
All
on
around
Rhino,
there, there's
around
strips
Crowd.
that are
A
entirely
beautiful building.
3-story apartment buildings.
Kind of near Mary Mumford.
Yeah,
It's like that.
So I mean, there's nothing stopping us from adding another district between these two if we need to. That's, between 2 and 12 units. We want to do that. But I think as we've sort of said before, the chances, even if you allow the sort of small apartment building, chance of somebody acquiring a bunch of like old row houses, apartment, that is very, very
Right.
great.
What about within, say, RC, doing the thing where it's like on corners or on major streets or something? Like a potential 4 unit, but that's not allowed in the entirety of wherever that district is.
Yeah, so RC would mostly be associated with the residential land use, which again, it's tough because I don't want to go too far beyond what Richmond 300 is saying, which is saying it's mostly single family, and
Right.
we're saying up to
Sure.
2 family.
Yeah.
But if
Well,
there
then
was
that
something
case,
between
sure,
C-
yeah.
if there was something between C and D, it probably would be along those major streets that are on the edges of the residential area.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification that RC is just in what we're calling what's residential, because in that case, maybe there is a need for something between C and D.
And then just so I could just ask you, Maritza, the point before about E not liking this. I'm fine to get rid of it, but do you feel okay about having buildings coming up to the street there? I put that in mostly because it was like a sort of, seemed like a very different character that maybe should be accommodated somehow, but.
I mean,
Talking about allowing or
Allowing,
requiring.
yeah.
I mean, the future of Chamberlain Avenue is gonna be really different.
Yeah.
So they're gonna put BRT in it. The plans right now show the median going away. So like the character of the street is gonna like dramatically change.
Yeah.
And those are super deep lots, which like, then you get these like silly buildings that are perpendicular to the street.
It must say 250 feet deep.
Yeah, and if a developer could acquire a couple of those silly buildings that are perpendicular next to each other, then they would have a pretty big parcel, but then they'd be like pushed back, and you'd be like, there's gonna be BRT running down the middle and like.
Right.
And they
8
are
years.
architecturally unremarkable buildings for the
They're
most
also
part.
affordable. They're also affordable housing.
Well, they are. That's true. Which is important, but
There's more land for density.
there may be somebody who wants to replace it, and
Whatever it's replaced with will not be affordable.
I feel like
that would be,
That's true, and that's just what the market might end
That's
up
right.
doing, and
or it could be a good light side.
I mean, it already is. You see light tech happening on the southern end of Chamberlain. Yep. Mhm. So I mean, like, I don't know, it's just.
I feel like that's part of the conflict I was talking about. So are we trying to mimic existing development patterns versus shake it up a little bit where it makes sense to?
Yeah.
I mean, it could be that you have it be this. Now and then it gets rezoned. When the BRT goes in with one of the other districts.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the setbacks, there's 3 options. There's, requiring the existing setbacks. There's allowing buildings to come up the street, but also allowing the setback.
Yeah.
And there's forcing buildings to come up the street.
I mean, I
right?
think
So-
it'd be like, I wouldn't require buildings to be 20 feet setback. Like if it wants to be closer.
Yeah.
Why,
Yeah.
So especially on a corridor that is. I mean, it's gonna take a while. It's gonna take 5 years.
More.
Depending on, what happens
invest
with how
in
people
that.
live. And I still like all these things.
So we're getting down to the wire. Are there any other like burning questions that can't wait until December? Because I want to give Renee time to give us our next steps. And I think you had some questions, but we may not get to those, but maybe that's some food for thought for the next meeting. How do you want to?
Yeah, so I'm kind of giving the next steps, but I can go over the questions quickly. We don't like to answer them, but I can just put them out to you right now. That's.
And you'll also, we'll get those through email as well. Okay. Wayne, were you raising your hand? I'm sorry.
Yes, I just had a quick question about residential E.
Yeah.
Okay, so was the purpose of that photo to show the angle of the land or the?
Yeah,
Setback.
it's probably a bad photo, but the point was to sort of say, do we need a special kind of residential zone that has a really big kind of green front setback as opposed to the other ones which are, coming closer, particularly like these ones here, which are like a lot more urban.
Okay, I think the photo kind of threw me off as far as what I was looking at.
Yeah, sorry.
Are there any other photos that could?
I don't have any on hand right now, but I think the idea was thinking about Chamberlain, again, which has this sort of, big kind of front lawn kind of condition right now.
Okay,
Or potentially looking forward to the future of like, those sort of edges of the residential area where you have a major street. And right now they're mostly single family homes, but maybe there's a kind of future version of that where you allow apartments, but you still force a big kind of green setback in some places to people like that. I don't know.
I just want to say, if you take away all that green space, you're starting to create more of these heat maps. It's gonna be hot. Like the areas in the south side that don't have any grass, it's miserably hot. Like you said, 10 degrees, it may be 20 degrees hotter sometimes in the summertime. So that's probably why they want the green space, keep things a little cooler. I know we want the land, but we also have to preserve some of the green space. We just have to. Some place, yeah.
That's like, I guess to Roger's previous point too about preserving open space.
That's really important.
I mean, most modern ordinances, including the ones you guys have worked on, a lot of requirements for open space and improved open space.
So the question is where is the open space? So is it in the front setback or is it in the back or is it on a rooftop?
On a rooftop,
or
yeah.
whatever. So,
Yeah.
okay, so if you guys don't mind, I'm just going to leave you with a few questions to think about. So some general questions just about the kind of the overall structure. Do the zoning district names or abbreviations or groupings, are they clear or do you think they could be improved? It makes sense or not? Do you think the kind of ABC style prefixes work or not for you? Does it make sense to call some of the zoning districts mixed use and others not? Discussion with staff where like you could say arguably all of them are kind of mixed use to different degrees. Obviously, there's a kind of spectrum of mixed use. For example, RDX is mostly residential, but includes some limited mixed uses. We put it into the residential category for now. Richmond 300 has mixed use in many, but not all of its land use categories. So just thinking about the naming and stuff, about how we kind of present this. Are the commercial mixed use and industrial mixed use groupings clear? It seems like maybe they're not. Both these would permit, potentially fully residential buildings. So maybe we should use a different term. I'm not sure. Just thinking about the names. And it's certain key defining standards for each zoning district. Are there other standards that you think are important to show up front? Obviously, if we get to the detail work, we'll be adding a lot more. But it sounds like things like open space or coverage or things you'd like to see sooner rather than later, perhaps. Maybe there's others, I'm not sure, but think about that. And then some of the more specific questions about certain land uses for the residential and residential mixed use category. A lot of these we did talk about with you guys in previous meetings, but any new reactions to these? I guess, again, we're thinking about specifically some of the questions that were asked today about, potentially adding a new one between C and D, or, how we deal with, do we actually allow duplexes or two family units at the right in B and C or not? So any other thoughts you have about that would be great. For commercial mixed use, a lot of these, we've deliberately kind of held these in common between the Richmond 300 categories of community, corridor, destination, and downtown mixed use, rather than having a sort of separate set for each one of these, just to kind of save space. Although obviously some of them will fall into one more than others. Does that work for you guys, or do you think there's something intrinsically special about community versus corridor mixed use that requires, something different like in height? we called it. The other question here, which is, this is actually kind of a big one for me. All the districts we presented are, well, let's say maybe not RE actually, but most of them are like relatively urban, particularly when it comes to the commercial mixed use ones. And so, which I think aligns with the vision for Richmond 300, but is there a kind of realistic, shorter term kind of thing where we have to allow a more suburban style of commercial? If somebody wants to build, a very nicely designed, but more suburban style commercial use along a corridor somewhere, do we allow that? Right now, we're basically saying, no, you gotta come up the street and everything. But maybe there's some place in the city where that's still appropriate in the short term. So that's a question for you. Do we try and sort of force a kind of better style of suburban commercial, or do we just say, no, you can't do it? So, question for you guys. For industrial mixed use, we've already addressed this. Do you think there's too many of these? Could we consolidate them or frame them in a different way? And then for the other districts, for the institutional, is the one study district enough, or do we need to differentiate between different sizes? Say big campuses versus smaller institutional. And do you have any concerns or thoughts about the open space districts? Do those work for you? Again, it's a new concept for Richmond. So I think some of this we've already touched on. The one thing I would really ask you to think about is the suburban style commercial to have districts that comment. So
Thank you, Renee. So, Mary Ann, if you could get these questions to the group so that we can be thinking about them between now and December, and take some time to go through the presentation. Mary Ann said staff is obviously available between now and then, but we definitely want to come prepared to take a deeper dive into some of what we've opened today, correct? Yeah. Okay. So I want to keep everyone on schedule. I just want to let you know that our next meeting had a request to move back to the City Hall meeting space. So at our next meeting on December 11th, we'll be meeting at 4 p.m. in the 5th floor conference room of City Hall. That's all that I have from the agenda, but I did fail to mention that we have Councilmember-elect Andrew Breton with us tonight, First District. So thanks for sitting through and taking a deep dive into what's coming your way when you take office in January. So if there's nothing else to come forward the group, we can go ahead and adjourn. Thank you, everyone.
You got it.
good seeing you. Good one.
Naturally.
And I wonder.
Why can't we?
Yeah, Thursday. Yeah, I mean, where's that?